Very big welcome to all of the R2 team and our brokers and clients and friends that are listening in from all around the country. And a very big welcome to Bruce Whitfield. It's really fantastic to have you with us on this Friday afternoon. It's great to have everyone here this afternoon, and thanks again, Bruce, for spending your Friday afternoon with us. I don't think Bruce needs much of an introduction, but he is the host of The Money Show on 702 in Cape Talk. He's an award-winning financial journalist. Some people say he's got a face for the radio, but I don't really think so. He's certainly he's certainly got a voice that you will recognize. And I think most recently he's an author of a really fantastic book called The Upside Down.
Hold it up.
Okay, let me hold up the book for you. I've got to get
technological. I got a message from my publishers today, Justin, to say that it is number 2 in South Africa today. It has been climbing. It was number 4 last week and it's number 2 this week, just behind Wilbur Smith. And so I've recently seen Wilbur Smith at my local shopping center. And the next time I'm going to push him down some stairs, because then I could be the number 1 living author, if that's not too impolite. But yes, Wilbur Smith is at number 1, and that book is at number 2. So to anyone who has bought it, thank you. And for those of you who haven't, if you've never liked Wilbur Smith and you just want to get revenge on him, then go buy the book and you can nudge him off number 1 spot. That'll be your public duty.
Great stuff. Thank you, Bruce. And as I said to those of you who've just joined, Bruce has twisted our arm to buy a couple of copies of his book, which we did so happily. So we will be sharing a few copies of his book with our team and with some of our brokers. And if you want a copy, we'd ask that you tag us on social media, I too, and use the hashtag Upside, because I think today is mostly what we're talking about, Upside. You get extra points if you mention Bruce Whitfield and how good his book is, and we will have a couple of copies of his book to give out to our brokers and our team members. So tag I too on social media, hashtag Upside, and pay a great mention to Bruce and his book. And we've got a couple of copies to give away. But that's enough from me. So I'm going to hand over to Bruce now, and Bruce is going to tell us a little bit about his book, and he's going to talk to us for about half an hour. And then after that time, I'm going to ask him a few questions, and it's going to be great to see Bruce on the receiving end of questions this time. And I would also like to ask you, if you do have questions for Bruce during his presentation, please put them on the message group, and we will make sure that we ask him as many as we can afterwards. So thank you very much, Bruce, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Cheers, Justin. Thanks very much indeed. Hello, everybody. I mean, who would have thought that 2020, which at the beginning of this year was being billed by some optimists as 20-plenty, was going to turn out just the way it has? What a dog show it has become. 2020 started out with huge optimism. I was lucky enough to be in Davos at the World Economic Forum in January, and the mood there was really, really strong. CEOs were feeling fantastic. The year before, they'd been feeling dark and gloomy because the stock markets had had a terrible December, but things were looking up. The US markets were at record levels. Economic growth was set for infinite possibilities. Unemployment in the United States was sitting at record lows. Donald Trump came to Davos this year and essentially launched it as the beginnings of a US election campaign that's happening in November. There were the beginnings of the rumblings of a virus in China. Not that anybody was too worried about it. We'd seen Ebola just a couple of years ago. We'd seen SARS in 2003. We'd seen MERS. We'd seen a bunch of other so-called pandemics. Just how serious could yet another bug be, a virus, a pandemic be, if it was coming out of China this time? Nobody took it particularly seriously. It was only until mid-February, of course, that suddenly the horror story began to unfold. And then we saw markets capitulate, we saw economies capitulate, we saw denial in some countries from politicians. But suddenly all of the best laid plans, all of those ideas that we thought that we would be bringing to fruition this year, in this year of 2020, were going to be delivered upon. And suddenly it has all changed. And nothing in our collective memory has changed this quickly. I suppose the last time we had such a dramatic shock was probably 9/11, where suddenly nobody knew what tomorrow held. There'd been a terror attack on the United States. We'd seen the Twin Towers collapse, these great symbols of American capitalism. and suddenly the world was on edge. And the world has changed fundamentally, of course, since that time in ways that we don't necessarily appreciate the magnitude of. But air travel globally became a lot more complicated. The world became a little bit edgy. We saw the United States move into the Middle East very aggressively, and we've seen the consequences play out 15 years later, 16, 17, 18 years later, of the massive disruption that those invasions of the Middle East caused on economies in that area. The Syrian crisis, for example, was a Syrian crisis until millions of people started moving towards Europe and started moving through Turkey, and President Erdogan of Turkey threatening to open up his borders to release a further 3 million refugees into Europe. And here's the problem with short, sharp, sudden shocks, is that although in the moment we are absolutely petrified and we don't know what the health outcomes are of this pandemic and how long it lasts and how long it causes a downturn in our economy, what is more concerning is how this plays out, not even in the next 5 years, but its consequences 10, 15 years from now. Larry Summers, who's a former US Treasury Secretary, has been writing over the last couple of days how he believes that this is a moment in human history, a little bit like the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It was a local issue where Gavrilo Princip and a couple of others, young students at the time in Bosnia, decided that they should assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And what it did was set about a huge catalyst of events which led to World War I. World War I then, of course, transformed into the Treaty of Versailles, which was a draconian treaty designed to punish Germany from ever misbehaving again. And it ultimately led to the rearming of Germany. It led to the rise of Hitler. It led to all kinds of terrible consequences. So we must never look at items that, like the COVID-19 crisis that is playing out right now, as a just now problem. It is certainly a long-term issue because it's causing a reshaping of everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. I'm currently working on a cover story for the Financial Mail, which will be out on the first Wednesday of June. And I've been talking to chief executives across the South African economy, from mining to banking to retail to industry. And I've been canvassing their views on what the future of work looks like. And I'm afraid it's fairly ugly. It's going to mean that the world of work is going to change fundamentally. It is going to mean that the nature of the office as we know it changes fundamentally into the future. It's going to change the way we interact, and these sorts of meetings are going to become increasingly normal for those of us who started out in these meetings about a month or 6 weeks ago and kind of went to ourselves, they won't last long. I can stare at the little bright light on my camera for hours on end. Isn't it hilarious? And for those of us who've got kids who go through a homeschooling process and the school is delivering education via digital means, we're very lucky to have it. But at the same time, kids are beginning to just lose their sense of enthusiasm for it because it's changing the way we interact. It's far less tactile, it's far less intimate, and certainly I can't see the expression on your face right now, which I really do thrive on normally when I'm in an audience environment, because you can get some feedback, you get visual cues from people in that environment. So this is normal. It's going to be normal for the foreseeable future. These big boys over here, this is a particularly good one made by a guy who makes cycle kit in Cape Town. It's breathable and fits very nicely. But we're going to be wearing these. I think I certainly feel guilty for smirking at every Asian person I ever saw on an aeroplane in South Africa going, what on earth are you wearing that mask for? And I'm sure we've all felt the same. But these are people who lived through the SARS crisis in Hong Kong and in China. These are people who have seen the consequences of ignoring the very worst effects of a pandemic. And I suspect that this is going to change our mindset when it comes to the way in which we act in the world for a very, very long time, if not forever, but certainly for a long time. We're going to be considerably more cautious. And as Mike Tyson so famously said, and I can't do his lisp appropriately, so I won't, everyone has a plan until you get punched in the mouth. Now, I challenge you not to get too frightened at this particular point. I'm not predicting the return of Jacob Zuma. He's got bigger problems to face right now than he would wish for. But imagine just for a moment, if there is an upside to where South Africa is in this particular crisis as we stare down the barrel of an economic contraction of anything between 7 to 10 to worst estimates I've seen so far, 16% this year. Just contemplate for a moment how much more catastrophic it would have been had this oak been at the helm of the presidency. I'm sorry, it would have been, we would have been in so much trouble. The lack of professionalism in his government, just the manhandling of government in the decade that Jacob Zuma was in power. I've got to get rid of his face. I can't look at it. But there we go. This guy, Cyril Ramaphosa, in happier days, he became president, 3 years ago now, and has led the very gradual and slow grinding transformation of state institutions as he has tried through consensus to rebuild South Africa's status in the world, has tried to get consensus to get South Africa to a point where it can hold its head high once again after the decade of mismanagement under Jacob Zuma. Cyril Ramaphosa, of course, has been handed this COVID-19 crisis. It is a crisis that he grabbed with both hands. It's almost as if he needed the crisis to solidify his position as president of South Africa. And those first few, my fellow South Africans, compatriots, whatever term he chose to use, were quite remarkable landmark Cyril Ramaphosa moments. And then he went quiet for 3 weeks and then came back with his fairly nondescript speech of about 10 days ago, which people then looked and said, hold on a second. But this is a guy who doesn't seem to have full control of the country. This is also a guy, though, who is in meetings like this one and in other far more serious meetings for 18 to 20 hours a day at the moment. He's also expected to make public appearances. He's also expected to be orchestrating quite possibly the most considerable challenge any South African government has seen since the dawn of democracy. This is a proper crisis. Luckily, he's not doing it alone. What we've seen from the Reserve Bank over the last year, this time last year, money cost 10.25% at prime. Yesterday, it went down to 7.25%. We've seen the cost of money effectively drop by 30% over the last year. Unprecedented times calling for unprecedented policy response. Lesitja Kganyago, who's been a bastion of fortitude at the Reserve Bank, has been nothing short of remarkable in withstanding the huge assaults that he saw in his first term as Reserve Bank governor, attempts to nationalize the Reserve Bank and all kinds of other red herrings, as we've seen elements of the ANC try to seize control of the fiscus and try to find new ways to squeeze blood out of the South African stone after years of plunder. But Lesitja Kganyago has held firm, and now, as governor of the Reserve Bank, is very much got his hand on the tiller. Also, by announcing that the Reserve Bank would become buyer of last resort of South African bonds, that has sent a very positive message into markets, and we've seen the cost of South Africa's borrowing fall sharply as a result. So Lesitja Kganyago certainly has been a very reliable pair of hands. Another guy who is doing incredible work but has got a huge mountain to climb is the country's tax collector. Never before has anybody been so welcomed back to a tax office as Edward Kisvet. He'd worked there previously before going into the private sector and then found his way back as a trusted ally of President Cyril Ramaphosa and Pravin Gordhan and others within government. Edward Kisvet has got a huge job to do in terms of restoring the credibility of SARS, because tax collections are falling off a cliff. Just this afternoon, there's a story on News 24 that, of course, is Anna Dlamini Zuma, who's the Minister of COGTA, Cooperative Governance, Minister, and effectively the Minister of Regulations right now in terms of the way in which this COVID-19 response is playing out. And she's looking to extend the ban on alcohol and cigarettes until we get to stage 1, which is, I don't know, October, November. I mean, some of you guys are going to learn how to protest fairly soon, I suspect, if she gets her way there. But what's happening is that's just one small example of how the wheels of government are not talking to each other, how government is not understanding that it is desperately in need of the revenues that are generated, not only from cigarettes and tobacco, those come into the billions of rand, but also in terms of opening up an economy which is ground to a halt. I'm seeing a lot more cars on the roads. I've been very lucky in the last couple of months that I've been able to come to an office every single day to talk on the radio, and that's given me some kind of perspective as to what's happening in the outside world beyond just going from home to the shops and back. And a lot of people have got some very serious cabin fever as a result. Many of you will have that. Many of your clients will have that. But what I have seen is that economic activity did stop, and it stopped precipitously, and government revenues are in tatters. And what we do have to do somehow is get an economy opening up, albeit slowly and gradually and carefully and in a sanitized and safe fashion, but economic activity does have to return. And government's got to go for some easy wins. And frankly, cigarettes and alcohol are easy. We just hear far too many stories of people doing stupid things to go and buy contraband cigarettes upon which no tax is paid anyway for 4 or 5 times the price of a box of smokes in a shop normally. And it's just leading to this growth of this gangster illicit economy. You've got to be careful of that. If you could keep your microphones turned off, that would be lovely. Then there's this man, his name is De Ruyter, and he is the chief executive of Eskom, inheriting the biggest poison chalice in South Africa. Eskom, of course, has got the very keys to whether or not South Africa survives or dies as it comes out of this lockdown. As we went into the lockdown, we were consuming north of 30,000 megawatts a day, and we're now sitting on about 23,000 megawatts, and that will climb. Are we going to another period of load shedding? Well, Eskom did its best yesterday to convince us that we're not. But when last did we believe Eskom or anything it said? Certainly, we hope that as economic activity returns, we don't see load shedding. But just in case we do, I've prepared just a couple of slides to help you understand some new terminology that you're going to need to learn. Load sprinting is when you have to work at an accelerated pace to finish the work that you're doing before the power goes out and the battery power on your laptop dies. You can do load shifting. Now, this was in the good old days, I suppose, of when coffee shops were open. But you're not going to be able to load shift nearly as easily as you used to be able to. You couldn't just close up your laptop, get in your car and go to your neighbor's house because now with social distancing, it becomes considerably more difficult. You could do this, which is load shirking, of course. You could say, it's not my fault, the power went out, my broadband went down, I couldn't do any work, so instead I went to go and sulk in my room. I couldn't even have a glass of wine to console myself because that's illegal under the circumstances. Or you could just do what most of us do, and that is swear, curse, and spit, and have an absolute frothy, because although it doesn't fix the problem, hell, it makes you feel so much better that you did. But here is South Africa's great conundrum. And this is a quote from Piet Mouton, who's the Chief Executive Officer of PSG, one of the most successful South African startups of the last 3 decades. Yanni Mouton, Piet's father, started PSG. He bought the first company that he bought was Professional Assignments Group, and over time helped build companies like Curo in private education, and that will flourish under these circumstances. And of course, Capitec. And I want to use Capitec as an example here because I think it epitomizes so much of what holds us back as South Africans, but also expresses so much of what is possible in South Africa. Last year, in November, Capitec was named for the 3rd time in a decade the top 100 companies of the JSE, as named by the Sunday Times Top 100 Companies Awards. It has constantly delivered superlative returns to investors. Now, sure, it's come off the boil recently, and PSG has said it's going to unbundle its stake in Capitec, and that's put a bit of downward pressure on Capitec. But the Capitec story is nothing short of extraordinary. I mean, who would have thought in 2001, just as we were going into a banks crisis, you remember Sambo collapsed, and then after that we saw a run on BOE, it collapsed, and then there was a run on Nedbank, and only when government stepped in as the lender of last resort there and said, we guarantee Nedbank deposits, don't panic everybody, that everything calmed down. But as a result of that, the vast majority of the small banks that existed around that time went to the wall. They collapsed. They disappeared into the history books, so much so that the history books are probably never even going to note their existence. But Capitec did succeed, and you could have bought Capitec shares at about 76 cents at the bottom in 2001, and at the peak, of course, they were trading around 1,500 Rand a share. Today, closer to about 900. But Capitec is a great South African success story because here you had a market that was dominated by the big 4 banks. There was no space in the market for another bank, at least so you might have thought at the time. But for entrepreneurs who are looking for opportunities, South Africa is awash with them if you're willing to look with a different lens, and if you're prepared to look with a growth mindset, and if you're prepared to consider what other people see as a dead-end idea. Nobody in the formal banking sector at the time saw Capitec-style banking, a micro-lending operation growing into what is now a fully-fledged retail banking operation with 14 million clients on their books. Nobody else saw that opportunity but a handful of guys who'd been in banking for a couple of years between them, and they saw that opportunity. It's one of the founders of Waze who told the Sunday Times Top 100 Companies Awards in 2018. He said, you know what, you make a lot more money out of solving misery than you do out of creating comfort. And that's a useful thing to remember in this COVID-19 crisis, where it feels like the world is coming to an end. There are always going to be opportunities. It just takes a particular kind of mindset to see them. So the people I like to talk about are some of the people who are featured in this, and to give the Star Wars theme, but my kids are Star Wars fans. I've fallen asleep in every single Star Wars movie I've ever tried to watch. But these are the sort of people I like to refer to as the rebels and the renegades and the problem solvers. These are people who add positivity to our world. These are people who have created businesses that are solving problems. And I'll tell you some of their stories in just a little while. But we spend far too much of our time in South Africa, frankly, focusing on these guys, the rascals and the reprobates and the problem causers, whether there be Ace Magashule and his reign of destruction in the Free State, whether it be the Guptas or whether it be Marcus Jooste, whether it be any one of the people that has helped bring South Africa to its knees from a fiscal point of view, and also, quite frankly, make us feel like second-class citizens anywhere in the world, simply because we've lost our sense of global self-esteem. There was a time where, as a South African, you felt you could do absolutely anything, anywhere, and you could take on the world. These guys have contributed very significantly to the destruction of the South African psyche, and the sooner we can see them in jail, frankly, the better. But the world is also in a very challenging place. This man is called Robbie Rosen. Robbie Rosen, in case you don't know your Nando's history, is the co-founder of Nando's, which he started in 1987 with his friend Fernando Duarte. And they started in Rosettenville with a single store. They took over an existing restaurant, and they decided that they were going to make the best damn chicken anywhere. And out of that grew the Nando's business, of course, which is part of the Hollard family, owned by the Eindhovens. And it's gone global. And I'm hoping that Nando's will survive in all of the markets that it has gone into, with all of the lockdowns and the restrictions that it has faced. But Robbie Rosen is quite possibly the most annoying man I've ever met, from a positivity and enthusiasm point of view. You understand, it's a very positive annoyance. He came up to me in the airport one day and he gave me this quote. And he said, if you quote me directly. Eh? And those of you who know Robbie know that he's a fun guy. You know that he's a very, very smart guy, but you also all know that he's got a heart of gold. And this, he reminds me of Tigger in the Winnie the Pooh stories. As South Africans, we tend to be a little bit more Eeyore than Tigger. We're told, oh, it's a beautiful sunny day outside here in Cape Town. And then Eeyore will come along and say, yeah, but if you go outside, you'll get COVID-19 and skin cancer and you'll die. Whereas Tigger just enjoys the sunshine and enjoys the bounce and enjoys getting about. Robbie Rosen's point, though, was that the world has got a leadership crisis all of its own. For all of South Africa's problems and difficulties and challenges and constraints and great problems that we have, if you just look at some of the leadership that has emerged around the world in recent years, you've got to realize that actually the world has got a leadership crisis, whether it's Vladimir Putin, and I don't know if I trust the stats that are coming out on COVID-19, for example, out of Russia, Kim Jong-un, who the moment he realized there was a global crisis brewing, decided to do some nuclear missile tests and pop those into the ocean near Japan just to shake things up a little bit. Donald Trump, who is doing goodness knows what in the United States. He went to a Ford plant yesterday, refused to wear a mask because he said he was winding up journalists because he thought that would be a bit of fun. This is a guy who faces a very significant electoral defeat in November. And I can make that prediction quite confidently with fingers crossed like that, because no sitting US president has ever won an election in a rising unemployment environment. And what's happened in the US economy, with more than 30 million people unemployed in the last 6 weeks, is nothing short of an historic occasion. For Boris Johnson, who had to go into intensive care to be treated for COVID-19 because he had initially also refused to treat the issue very, very seriously, thought that herd immunity would be the best way through for the United Kingdom, has also got a huge number of political trials and tribulations on his plate. In the background of the COVID-19 crisis, of course, is Britain's exit from the European Union, which must happen by the end of January next year. We've got Bolsonaro in Brazil, who's another denialist of COVID-19 and its seriousness, and Brazil is very rapidly getting into a crisis mode in terms of the outbreak there and the sheer lack of controls. And then Erdogan in Turkey, of course, is also somebody to watch in terms of geopolitics and the critical sort of positioning of Turkey as that bridge between Europe and Asia. And never before has it been more important, of course, particularly as we're likely to see over the next couple of years, migrant crises evolve in many, many parts of the world as economies take a huge amount of strain. One of my favorite quotes comes from Adrian Gore, and this is a useful one because it does challenge what we see as Armageddon. If it's not Armageddon, you should be building. Now, I haven't had time to speak to Adrian Gore in the last 10 weeks or so, but I'm looking forward to my first conversation with him because the first question that I'm going to ask him is whether or not he sees COVID-19 as Armageddon. And the answer to this quote came from a question I asked him when he was building Discovery Bank, and I was saying to him, "Are you completely nuts in the environment that we were in, spending 5, 6, 7 billion rand on building a brand new bank in an environment which was very anti-bank at the time?" Of course, we'd seen Bell Pottinger wreak havoc with the Reserve Bank, and we'd seen the calls for the nationalization not only of the Reserve Bank, but of banks generally, and people should have access to bank deposits, and money should become cheaply and freely available, and risk mitigation should go out the window. It was a really difficult time. And I said to Adrian Gore, "How are you building in this time?" And he said, "You know what, you've got to look through the crisis." And it got me thinking just to how many of South Africa's great business leaders have looked through crisis. And in my book, The Upside of Down, which is available in all good bookstores, well, the good bookstores now have run out of stock, but the book has been goes into the detail of some of these guys who've built businesses, and I say guys generally, but have built businesses through thick and thin in South Africa. Remarkable individuals who've created remarkable enterprises. One of those, and I tell the story in a bit more detail in The Upside of Down, is Bidvest and Brian Joffe's vision. Now, this is a poster that's up in every single Bidvest facility in the country. And it says, "Bidvest does not participate in any recession." And you think to yourself, that is the nuttiest thing I have ever heard expressed, because if you're in a recession, of course you're in a recession. You are participating in that damn recession, whether you like it or not. But it does go down to the very important mindset issue. And mindset is what it is all about. Mindset doesn't fix your problems. Mindset doesn't make COVID-19 go away. Mindset doesn't make your customers buy. But mindset does make you fighting fit to be in a better position as whatever it is, whatever product or service you deliver, to outperform your competitors. People with a negative mindset are going to struggle in this environment. You don't want to be Pollyanna-ish. You don't want to be all Tiggerish all the time and be happy and cheerful and be that annoying person who clearly has no perspective on what's going on in the world. But generally, I think what this Bidvest statement goes to is it's about navigating obstacles. And right now, we've got some of the biggest obstacles of our lifetimes that have to be navigated. And those that do navigate them successfully will come out on top. I was talking to one of the country's top estate agents today, and they were saying that they're anticipating that the vast majority of real estate agencies are going to collapse in the next couple of months. There's just no way that the mom and pop real estate agents can survive this COVID-19 crisis. We can't even get properties transferred through the deeds office right now. You can't do show days anymore. And those with deep pockets may be able to do digital show days, may be able to do those sorts of things. But for example, there are going to be people who go out of business and lose their jobs. But it is all, I'm afraid, part of a big and long-running cycle. Throughout history, we have seen companies come and go. We have seen people make huge fortunes in times of crisis, and we've seen people lose their livelihoods in times of crisis. It is about the fitness to survive. It's almost quite Darwinian in its perspective. In South Africa, we're told, you know what, we don't have the appropriate skills to rebuild our economy. Well, there's so many initiatives that are ongoing in South Africa right now. There's a young woman called Arlene Mulder who runs a non-profit called We Think Code. It's funded by the banking sector in South Africa, and what they do is they get young kids from the ages of 16 to, and I say young kids, younger people, 16 to 35, with aptitude and attitude into their coding rooms, and they put them through the rigors of a 2-year course, and it is brutal, it is relentless, it is tough, and if you drop out of that course, they chuck you out. There are no second chances. But what they're trying to do is get a new skills base for a digital age, and more you see the importance of people like Arlene Mulder. And there are others too who run incubators, of course, to help like this. Education, South Africa's biggest problem, as we prepare to send kids back to school from the 1st of June. A lot of parents are quite filled with trepidation, as our teachers and teachers' unions are pushing back. But there are some great private school examples of what has happened in education as a response to a failing system in South Africa over the last 2 decades. In this environment, one of the biggest growth industries has been private education, even though only about 5% of all school-going kids are educated in the private system. This COVID-19 crisis provides an opportunity for really innovative solutions. One of my favorite entrepreneurs in this sector, and you'll see her on my ENCA show next week called Taking Stock. Her name is Stacey Brewer. I'd like to catch up with her from time to time because she's a deeply energetic and enthusiastic proponent of education. And she uses digital technologies, she uses school classrooms, and over the last 7 years, she's built a business that employs 1,000 teachers, educates 15,000 kids for the same price every single month, about 2,200 Rand as government spends per child that it is responsible for educating, with considerably better outcomes. And this is where the entrepreneurial opportunity exists. In the food space, there's some such exciting companies and such exciting opportunities. Just this week, Aerobotics, which is one of my favorite agri-tech companies, they make drones and they put AI-based technologies on these drones to map orchards, for example, to map huge open tracts of land, particularly the rolling plains of the United States, where they're also doing experiments at the moment, to go and look for dry patches, to look for disease patches, to look for the yield of the crop, for example. In the olden days, a farmer would have to go into the middle of his orchard, he'd have to pick 10 trees at random, count the number of apples on each tree, and then estimate his entire harvest. But with flying drones over massive orchards, for example, you get a far better overview of what your crop is likely to be. They're now tying this in with insurance companies, for example. They're tying this up now in the insurance industry in a very convincing way to help risk mitigation in the insurance sector. So there are a huge number of potential spin-offs that can come from the likes of Aerobotics. As we look to food security, of course, as a future trend and a future thing that we need to worry about really very, very seriously. But just this week, Naspers, which has got a massive incubator fund, a 1.4 billion Rand incubator, extended 100 million Rand to Aerobotics so that they can further expand their agri-business. It's massively, massively exciting time. Aisha Pandor, who is one of my favorite young entrepreneurs of the moment as well. She started Sweep South. This is a business which she created with her husband because they kind of figured, why can we not deliver domestic help as a solution in the same way as Uber delivers a ride from A to B as a solution? And they built a platform, and now this platform is, of course, under pressure because the 15,000 women who have been getting work via this platform are not allowed to work at the moment. But what this platform has also enabled them to do is to do collaborations with insurers, with various players within industry to help alleviate some of the worst pressures on the lives of these women. And it's also enabled them to come up with a UIF solution for them as well. So it's been a very worthwhile project. The Naspers Incubator Fund, by the way, the Foundry, also last year put 30 million Rand into the jobs issue that is tackled by Aisha Pandor and Sweep South. So much so that they've used that 30 million Rand to create a brand new platform aimed at helping these guys, the plumbers and the tilers and the builders, anybody who can deliver a service. But when you go to Builders Warehouse on a Saturday morning, you remember going to Builders Warehouse on a Saturday morning, I'm sure it's a shop. Okay, it's a long time ago. I know it's hard to remember, but you go there and there'd be these guys sitting outside with these signs up, and you had no idea whether or not the guy was a plumber or whether the guy could tile straight. But if he had some sort of mechanism on a smartphone that said this is a 4-star or a 4.5-star or a 5-star tiler, you'd be more inclined, perhaps, to book their services. And so much of it is, I think, encapsulated beautifully by this particular story as I wrap up the formal part of today's presentation. And what we're seeing in South Africa, once again, is a bit of a revolution in banking. Time Digital and Time Bank now is using digital technologies very, very effectively to deliver financial services to lower income individuals. We've got Michael Jordan, who's teamed up with a whole bunch of ex-colleagues from FNB, and they are going to be launching Bank Zero later on this year. And of course, we've got Discovery Bank in the market as well. I don't know about you, but I don't know when last you went into a bank branch. In fact, this beautiful building, which is in Adderley Street in Cape Town, has been unoccupied for the last 6 or 7 years. Standard Bank simply doesn't know what to do with it. It can't knock it down. It's a heritage building. It's a beautiful site, but there's no parking nearby. So they really are at 6s and 7s as to what they're going to be doing with this building. But as they showed us last year when they closed more than 100 of their branches, simply because digital makes it so much easier to deliver financial services than ever before, because they're not nearly as sexy, as pretty, or as atmospheric, or evoke the nearly same emotion as the old Standard Bank building in Cape Town. But digital is the future. This is the way things are going to operate and change our future. And if you haven't worked that one out yet over the last 2.5 months, then I'm afraid you need to go for some extra lessons. I think Dr. Seuss probably saw this coming. Dr. Seuss, this is my second favorite business book of all time, after my own. It's called The Upside of, anyway, let's not go there again. But this is from a book called Oh, the Places You Will Go. It's one of my favorite books, Dr. Seuss. And there's a fabulous quote out of that, Oh, the Places You Will Go. Whether you like it or not, alone will be something, you'll be quite a lot. I think Dr. Seuss saw COVID-19 coming. And there's a very good chance that you'll meet things that will scare you right out of your pants. And I think over the last 6, 8, 12 weeks, we've all been quite frightened, and rightfully so. Not only because, of course, we're worried about the health consequences of COVID-19, but we're worried about our own immediate financial circumstances. Our clients are worried about their financial circumstances. And as a result, it's leading to a huge amount of constraint within the economy. And we'll get used to this, and we'll then move through it, and we'll find new ways of working. But the long-term consequences of this are what we have to keep an eye on. But as my kids learned in their music room at school, when they saw this sign, well, actually, I drew their attention to it. It's just under the light switch in their schoolroom. And it reads, "Dear pessimists, optimists, and realists, while you were arguing about the level of the glass, I drank it. Regards, the opportunist." South Africa is, and always has been, a country of extraordinary opportunity for entrepreneurs who are prepared to risk some capital and are willing to see a bright idea to conclusion. And South Africa is the land of the opportunist and opportunity. And there are countless stories that are some of which are in my book, and some of which I'll have to follow up in a next book, hopefully. But if you have a growth mindset, an opportunistic mindset, then South Africa poses a huge number of opportunities for you. Because right now it does feel a whole lot like this. I mean, you feel like a big wave surfer. You feel like you are riding on this wave. It's building behind you, and you have no idea how this damn thing is going to break. But what you have to do is keep your head. You have to maintain your balance. You have to stick to your plan. And you will come out of it, hopefully, in one piece. To quote one of my favorite philosophers, the problem, ladies and gentlemen, is not the problem. The problem, more often than not, is your attitude to the problem. It's the words of Captain Jack Sparrow in Pirates of the Caribbean. And frankly, right now, it is about finding solutions to the multitude of problems that are being thrown in our way as a result of COVID-19. It is unpredictable, it is difficult, it is dark, it is dangerous, and I get that. But at the same time, there are people who are going to come out of this in better shape than they went in, and they're going to be those that are going to be broken by this crisis. I think it's entirely up to you as to which way that plays out for you. That's it from me.
Thank you so much, Bruce, and great to hear some of your insights. So I'm going to ask anyone, if you do have any questions, you can please put them on the chat, and I will happily ask them to Bruce. And Bruce, maybe let's start with a couple of questions that I have while we give people some time to ask us some questions. So one of my favorite stories in your book is about you sitting in the little pub in Manchester. I thought it would be great if you could just share that, because it's a great story and it does give a great example about how South African companies can be successful on a global scale.
And it's the example everybody has forgotten about, I think, and that has been the remarkable story of S.A.B. Miller, which starts out as this little castle brewery in downtown Johannesburg in 1886. As Joburg is this tiny little one-horse town, and there's a hole in the ground and everybody's scrabbling for gold in the streets. And it becomes the mighty S.A.B. Miller, ultimately from the castle brewery to S.A. Breweries. It's listed in London, comes back to South Africa, goes back for another listing in London because it sees a global opportunity as South Africa emerges from the pariah status of apartheid. And we see, of course, the opportunity present itself not only on the African continent, where it gradually moves up and starts buying up breweries across Africa, but as the Iron Curtain falls across Europe, we start seeing opportunities come about in Eastern Europe in particular, where there are some hugely iconic beer brands in their respective markets. And there was this huge race, of course, for lots of beer brands. And I was sitting, it was around the time when Nhlanhla Nene got fired, and I was feeling a bit despondent and typically South African and wondering what the future held. And I ordered myself a Boddington's, which is the cream of Manchester. It's a very good beer if you drink it in Manchester. And I supped on my Boddington's and was counting the beer taps on the counter and could see that of the beers there were 6 or 7 that were brewed by SAB Miller. And there was Grolsch on the list there. There was Pilsner Urquell. There was Tyskie from Poland. There was Foster's, which SAB had just bought. And there were a whole bunch of these beers. And I just thought to myself, isn't it remarkable that this little company in Joburg, run by a couple of very bright and very capable South Africans, has taken over the world of brewing to the extent that it has. And of course, SAB Miller would then later on be taken out by AB InBev. And AB InBev, for multiple reasons, has basically destroyed the value that they paid for SAB Miller and is worth less today as the combined entity than AB InBev was when it bought SAB Miller, 3 years ago. There's been a huge value destruction in the global beer market. So SAB shareholders got out just in time at a very good price, I think £46 a share. But I stepped out into the sort of mid-afternoon gloom of a Mancunian afternoon, having had just one beer. This is an important part of the story. And as I was standing there, this Bidvest food services truck came trundling past me. And I thought to myself, I really must tell Brian that I've seen one of his trucks in Manchester. It's just what a lovely story. And as the truck disappeared down the road and I was watching it disappear down that way, there was a Nando's sign in the distance. And I was just blown away at that particular point as to how many great globally competitive and globally relevant companies have been spawned out of South Africa over the last couple of decades. And that sparked my initial corporate talk, which was called The Upside of Down, and it looked at various corporate histories of South African startups, involved the beginnings of the interviews with some of the founders of these great companies, and trying to distill what it is in them that makes them think that they're big enough and bold enough and capable enough of going into the wide blue yonder and competing worldwide. And some of the findings are in the book.
Thank you so much, Bruce, and that's a really great story. Contrary to that, in your book you talk about some of the great blunders of South African companies thinking that you need to go offshore to make a success and become a global company. So it would be great if you could share some examples of blunders, but I think also more importantly, you've also speak about some of the best performing companies on the JSE at the moment that are companies with a South African focus. And I think that's an important story for us South Africans to hear right now as well.
It's so easy to point a finger at management teams and to say, this chief executive took this decision and bought this company, whether it be Brait and New Look in the United Kingdom, or whether it be the numerous disastrous decisions, Old Mutual blundering around the world for nearly 2 decades before finally going, you know what, this is a terrible idea. Let's just go back and focus on what's made 75% of our profits over the last 20 years anyway, which is South Africa and other emerging markets. It just, that really struck me as being quite bizarre because of the South African mindset that you have to de-risk and you have to globalize and you have to get hard currency earnings. We've seen so many South African companies go and do it really, really badly. And yes, there's been, Steinhoff is a great example of a company that was growing on the back of a myth and a fraud, but was also growing off the back of a huge ambition. And so many retailers in particular have really, really blown it. But it struck me at the Sunday Times Top 100 Companies Awards last year, where I was lucky enough to be MC. And I stood up there and I looked at the top 3 companies. And I said, these guys have got one thing in common. They come across 3 completely different industries. One was in banking, one was in the pharmacy space, and one was a debt collector and a funder of taxis. And these 3 completely different companies were all the top 3 of the top 100 performing companies on the JSE over the previous 5 years. Now, It's no coincidence that all three of these companies have got their base in South Africa. They've not gone and had expensive dalliances offshore. What they've done is they've focused on their knitting in South Africa. And number one was Capitec. It hasn't spent a dime outside of South Africa looking for global expansion and global growth like the rest of the banks had done, blowing hot and cold over many years. And number two was Clicks, the pharmacy business of Clicks, and it has been nothing short of a stellar performer. And the great irony here is, well, most South African retailers that have gone offshore, except Woolies, which was run by an Australian born in Scotland, but most South African retailers have gone offshore to look for growth. Clicks, which was run by David Neal for more than the last decade, it was a British guy who'd worked for Boots, and he came from Boots to South Africa to turn around Clicks and saw the South African opportunity, where the rest were not really seeing that opportunity. And what is Clicks? Yes, it's a bit of pharmacy, but it's also health and beauty retail, and it's a very similar business model to what Dis-Chem is doing. And they're going neck and neck to try and mop up the South African health and beauty segment. And number three was very much a South African company, and that's Transaction Capital. Transaction Capital, which funds 15% of all taxis on the roads, runs a debt collection business. It also, I'm not too sure if it still owns Bayport, the microlender, but it may have sold out of that. I do know that it sold out of its ATM solutions business, but it's a complete focused business on South Africa and creating South African solutions to South African problems. And those were the three best places to get a good return, and a way better than the 5% average return that we've seen on the JSE for the last 5 years. You would have done 30% return over the last 5 years had you done an investment in those three companies alone. And so often we think you've got to be big and bold and fancy and global to make a killing. And yes, maybe that's what happens in the future. I don't know what the future holds. But certainly recent history tells us that companies that stuck to their target market, that didn't get big ideas beyond their station and focused on servicing local customers, did good. And they did it in a very, very successful way for the benefit of not only the people who work in those companies, but not only the customers of those businesses who have been well served by them, but also for their investors who have risked their capital with them as well.
Thank you, Bruce. We've got a fun question from James Shepherd, and he said, with the Upside published on 1 April, does Bruce type as fast as he talks? Or was the book written pre a COVID world? I think that's an interesting question, even though there's a bit of a fun in this. What made you decide to write this book on, it seems very appropriate right now?
I mean, again, it's been a book in waiting for the last 4 years, and I just haven't had the time to do it. And I was eventually dragged into kicking and screaming into a meeting with Terry Morris, who is the chief executive. Sorry for talking so fast, but there's so much to say. Terry Morris, who is the chief executive of Pan Macmillan in South Africa, and Terry is very convincing. And she was about 15 minutes late for the meeting, or I was 15 minutes early. And so I sat and I did my very first ever sort of spidergram. And I went, if she's going to ask me to write a book, then I better have an idea. And so I took the subject matter of 3 talks that I'd done over the years. The first one, The Upside of Down, then one called Thriving at the Edge of Chaos, and another called Rebels, Renegades, and Problem Solvers. And I put down what they were all about, and I put some key themes in, and I effectively sketched out 14 chapters and had a very different title for the book. And she came and I said to her, there's your book. And she went, okay, good. When would you like to publish it? And I said, well, if you give me any more than 3 months in order to write the damn thing, I'm never going to get it finished, because I'm a journalist and I work only on deadlines. And so she set a deadline of the 1st of December for the first draft. And I set about doing it. I delivered 65,000 words on the 2nd of December, and then went off on holiday and came back in the middle of January with my homework with red rings and all sorts of rude comments by the editor, who'd taken out 5,000 superfluous words and said, fix this mess. And it luckily kept the tone and the voice and the conversational tone of it very much intact. I added a few bits in. I then had just come back from Davos, so I added a few Davos bits in. I mentioned COVID in it, and I mentioned, of course, COVID is the great uncertain factor. So it gave me an opportunity to do that. But yeah, we sent it off to the printers. in March, and it hit the streets just as the lockdown was happening. And so I was looking forward to going and doing book launches. I had 3 big book launches arranged, one at the Book Lounge in Cape Town, one at Exclusive Books at the Waterfront, one at Exclusive Books at Hyde Park. There were going to be razzmatazz, free wine and snacks. And we didn't do a single one of them because all hell broke loose and the doors of the bookshops got locked, and nobody bought a book for a whole 6 weeks until just 2 weeks ago when the bookshops opened. And since then, fortunately, the books have been selling very, very nicely, and I'm very grateful for that.
Great. And another good example, I just watched your online bookshop, your book launch, and it was a really good example of how, when things change, you have to adapt. So we'll take a couple more questions. I've got a nice one here from Dale, and he says, does our government have the ability to make the bold decisions to open the economy, or is there too much internal squabble? And you've also spoke about great collaboration between business and government at the moment. So that would also be interesting to share some of those insights.
A couple of aspects of this. So Daily Maverick is planning to book launch for this time next week, actually. And they are trying to get Tito Mboweni to interview me, and I'm absolutely petrified because I do think Tito is going to have a couple of issues with the book, and that'll make it a fun discussion because he's quite bombastic and quite brash. And if he's had a bottle of Rubicon at lunchtime, it could go either way. But certainly it's the politics of the book is interesting. The timing of the book is interesting. And yeah, I've lost my train of thought. So the question was, what was it again?
Does the government have the ability to make?
Oh, does the government? Yes, it has certainly. Look, Tito Mboweni knows what. That's why I was telling you the Tito story. Tito knows what needs to be done. Tito is the guy. Cyril is the guy. They are on the same page, but they are in a room full of bombastic, mouthy, often blunt, to be blunt about it, clueless politicians. And at the risk of being offensive on this particular point, the average understanding of economics and the economy within Cyril Ramaphosa's cabinet is not of the highest order, and that is a big, big problem. You get a deep sense of frustration of this from Tito Mboweni, who every time he goes into a meeting has to first educate his audience and then say, okay, now let's have a vote. And if the vote goes against him, I mean, SAA, God bless him, I love SAA, its staff and its pilots and its onboard staff have been nothing short of remarkable. But it's been so badly mismanaged that it has to be put out to pasture. But Pravin Gordhan, for all of his good points, has got a mental block against allowing a state-owned enterprise to be declared bankrupt. So he is holding on tooth and nail to try and keep and preserve it. So it's an uphill battle. But on the collaboration point of view, just as we were going into lockdown, and I've had a couple of conversations with him since, somebody like a Richard Friedland and several other CEOs have said to me they've been completely blown away by how in a time of crisis they do see people pulling together. And unfortunately, and this is one of our great Achilles heels as South Africa, is that it does take crisis to bring us together. I talk about my first Davos visit just after Nhlanhla Nene got fired and how it was tumbleweed city for South Africa. It was only that crisis, however, that brought business and government to talk together to bring attempts to try and save the South African economy in 2016 and 2017. But as soon as we start having a bit of success, we become complacent, and complacency is our biggest risk from both the public and private sector perspective, because we start thinking, oh, government can't do it all, big business can't be trusted. We unfortunately need a fire in our belly in order to collaborate. And what the COVID-19 crisis has done has shown incredible collaboration across many, many spheres of public and private sectors. And long may it continue, because we are better off when we work together.
Thank you. Last question, Bruce. Is your book available in an electronic format?
It is available in an electronic format. Thank you for asking that very good question. It's available on Kobo and on Amazon.com, and you can get the Kindle versions on those. I was going out the week the lockdown happened. Everything was going to happen the week the lockdown happened. I was going to go and commit 3 mornings of my life to going and reading deliberately, and believe it or not, slowly, each word of the book, because it does take a particular kind of cadence when you're reading a book, apparently, as an audio book. It would have been a hell of a job, but I didn't get the audio book done. So we'll see if there's any demand for it, but I'm quite keen to go and read my book back to myself and see what it sounds like, I think.
Great. I think we'll wrap it up there, Bruce. Thank you so much for your time. It's been really great to have you with I2 and some of our team and brokers, and I hope you have a good weekend. To all of you listening,
What's a
I hope you've
weekend?
enjoyed.
Justin, what's a weekend? I'm sorry, I don't know what a weekend is. It's a line. It's a line from Downton Abbey where Maggie Smith's character doesn't know what a weekend is because she's part of the upper classes. But nowadays, I mean, we're even doing school on weekends to try and play catch up because teachers are trying to justify their existence by loading our kids with extra work. So it's all hell and bedlam 7 days a week right now. But you know what? It'll pass eventually, like a kidney stone passes. It hurts like hell, but you know when it's gone. And when it's gone, there's great relief. So hopefully it passes sooner rather than later.
Good, I'm sure it will. And yeah, thanks a lot and great discussion. We'll keep in touch with you, and we will be in touch to buy some of your books. And if you do want to win one of them, please post on i2 social media with the hashtag Upside. Say what a wonderful chat you had with i2 and Bruce, and you could win one of Bruce's books. And thank you very much.